I didn't do anything wrong. You can't arrest me.
This is private property, sir. You can't just. Julian's words caught in his throat as Officer Miller's hand, heavy and gloved, clamped down on his arm, steering him roughly away from the vibrant tangle of tomatoes and kale. We've received a complaint about a public disturbance, unapproved landscaping, and a general blight on community standards, Miller intoned, his gaze sweeping over the burgeoning food forest that had, just months ago, been a sterile patch of sod. Ms. Albright, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of pristine suburban uniformity, stood behind the officer, a smug, almost triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She looked at Julian as if he were a weed, about to be eradicated. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Julian wasn't just a homeowner with a penchant for radical gardening. He was Dr. Julian Vance, renowned agricultural ecologist, whose work on urban permaculture had redefined sustainable living for entire municipalities. A fact he'd deliberately kept quiet, hoping this project could just be his. This initial clash, the sheer disrespect in Miller's grip and Albright's sneer, was only the first ripple in a storm Julian knew was brewing. A storm that would force him to strategically unveil the HOA's twisted interpretation of their own rules, exposing Ms. Albright's deep-seated personal vendetta, and enduring the crushing weight of community gossip, all leading to a final, explosive confrontation where every assumption about him, about community standards, would shatter, revealing a truth far richer than any manicured lawn. Julian, Dr. Julian Vance, renowned agricultural ecologist, felt the rough grip of Officer Miller's hand on his arm, pulling him away from the verdant chaos of his burgeoning food forest. Ms. Albright, HOA president, watched, a satisfied smirk on her face. Public disturbance, unapproved landscaping, general blight, Miller recited, his gaze dismissive. We've received a complaint. Julian began to protest. This is private property, sir. This is a food forest, not a blight. Albright, however, cut him off with saccharine poison. Julian, darling, we tried. This mess cannot stand. It's affecting property values, not to mention the rats. Julian's jaw tightened. He knew their accusations were baseless, driven by a rigid vision of conformity. This confrontation was no mere dispute. It was the start of a protracted battle to defend his right to cultivate life and expose the petty tyranny hidden behind manicured hedges. He braced himself for the escalation of their claims, ready to unveil Albright's deep-seated personal vendetta. Julian's attempts to articulate the ecological benefits of his cultivated space were immediately dismissed. Officer Miller, acting on instructions derived from Ms. Albright, pronounced such explanations irrelevant in the context of the official complaints. The interaction established a confrontational dynamic, with the HOA's representatives prioritizing enforcement over detailed understanding of the property's composition or purpose. Ms. Albright substantiated the HOA's position by presenting documentation. This included a collection of photographic evidence, intentionally composed to depict the vibrant, growing ecosystem as an unkempt and visually discordant area. These images, captured from strategic angles, were designed to exaggerate the perceived disarray and contradict established community aesthetic norms. Concurrently, a petition was submitted purportedly signed by multiple residents expressing concerns regarding the property. The petition's content focused on alleged adverse impacts on neighborhood visual coherence and perceived property depreciation. Subsequently, the officers issued formal warnings. These communications outlined potential penalties, including significant financial fines and the imposition of a legally binding cease and desist order, which would mandate the cessation of all current landscape activities and the immediate remediation of the property. The assessment conducted by the responding officers appeared limited to the complaints articulated by the HOA president, demonstrating a procedural adherence to received grievances rather than an independent evaluation of the site. The situation quickly escalated beyond a mere dispute over landscaping preferences, evolving into a direct challenge to property autonomy and individual land use decisions within the community governance framework. The HOA's formal notice arrived, explicitly demanding the restoration of the traditional lawn aesthetic within a strict 7-day timeframe. This directive underscored the organization's unwavering commitment to its interpretation of community standards. The notice cited several perceived violations, categorizing Julian's food forest under broad and subjective classifications. These classifications included unsanitary conditions, despite the absence of any verifiable health or sanitation issues, attracting pests, a claim unsupported by evidence of increased pest activity, and blatant disregard for community aesthetics, a subjective assertion based on the visual deviation from conventional lawn models. The HOA's official communications consistently framed the food forest as a detrimental element to the collective visual harmony and economic stability of the residential area. Their primary contention revolved around the perception that the property's appearance negatively influenced property values throughout the community. This argument was predicated on the assumption that deviation from a standardized lawn landscape inherently diminished desirability and market worth. The complaints detailed were not specific to any measurable non-compliance with existing structural regulations, but rather focused on the aesthetic departure from a traditional, suburban landscape. The HOA asserted that Julian's horticultural methods constituted a public nuisance. Despite the absence of any demonstrable harm to neighbors or public welfare, their arguments frequently referenced vague clauses within the HOA bylaws, such as those pertaining to aesthetic standards and nuisance vegetation. These clauses lacked precise definitions regarding acceptable plant types or landscape designs, allowing for broad interpretation by the HOA board. The organization leveraged these ambiguities to define Julian's diverse and productive plant life as nuisance vegetation simply because it did not conform to the homogeneous, ornamental landscape prevalent in the community. This application of the bylaws demonstrated an expansive and restrictive interpretation, prioritizing uniformity over diverse land use. The HOA's procedural steps followed a predetermined escalation matrix, designed to exert increasing pressure. For compliance, initial verbal warnings were swiftly followed by the formal written notice, which detailed the alleged violations and the mandated remediation. Failure to comply with this notice was explicitly stated to result in the imposition of daily fines, progressively increasing in magnitude until the property conformed to the HOA stipulated standards. The communications maintained a formal and uncompromising tone, signaling the HOA's intention to pursue all available enforcement mechanisms. Their position was articulated as a defense of community integrity and the collective interests of property owners, positioning Julian's actions as a disruptive force within an otherwise harmonious environment. This deliberate framing served to isolate Julian and legitimize the HOA's aggressive stance as a necessary measure for maintaining order and protecting the neighborhood's character. Julian initiated a systematic review of all applicable regulations. This involved a meticulous examination of the Homeowners Association HOA bylaws, cross-referencing them with local municipal zoning ordinances and established agricultural codes. The objective was to identify any specific clauses that might prohibit the cultivation of food-producing plants or native species within residential properties. This comprehensive legal and regulatory audit revealed a lack of explicit prohibitions. The HOA bylaws contained only broad and subjective provisions concerning aesthetic standards and nuisance vegetation, without offering precise definitions that would unequivocally classify Julian's food forest as non-compliant. This absence of specific prohibitive language formed the cornerstone of his legal counterargument. Concurrently, Julian undertook a detailed documentation process of his property. This involved cataloging every plant species present within the food forest, meticulously recording their individual characteristics, growth patterns, and ecological functions. Each component of the ecosystem was identified and its specific role in promoting biodiversity, soil health, and sustainable resource management was noted. This detailed inventory served as empirical evidence of the project's deliberate design and ecological integrity, directly refuting generalized claims of overgrowth or unsightly mess. To further strengthen his position, Julian secured an affidavit from a recognized local horticulturist. This expert assessment provided an independent verification of the food forest's health, vitality, and beneficial environmental impact. The affidavit attested to the careful planning and sustainable practices employed, validating the project's legitimacy as a cultivated ecosystem rather than an unmanaged wild space. The horticulturist's professional endorsement countered the HOA's assertions that the food forest constituted a blight or an unsanitary area. Upon receiving the formal HOA notice demanding the restoration of the traditional lawn aesthetic within a 7-day period, Julian proceeded with his meticulously prepared rebuttal. This comprehensive document directly addressed each point raised in the HOA's notice. It systematically cited specific clauses from the HOA bylaws and relevant municipal codes, demonstrating his compliance. Furthermore, the rebuttal incorporated legal precedents pertaining to right-to-farm statutes and urban agriculture initiatives, arguing that his cultivation practices aligned with broader legal frameworks supporting sustainable food production in residential areas. The previously obtained horticulturist's affidavit was appended as an authoritative expert opinion, lending scientific credibility to his claims. The strategic presentation of this rebuttal targeted Officer Miller, who was designated for follow-up by the HOA. Julian maintained a composed and factual demeanor throughout this interaction, avoiding emotional appeals in favor of presenting verifiable data, legal interpretations, and expert testimony. This methodical approach aimed to highlight the baselessness of the HOA's claims and the arbitrary nature of their enforcement actions. The officer's initial dismissiveness, rooted in preconceived notions influenced by the HOA's complaints, began to waver. The sheer volume and specificity of Julian's evidence introduced an element of doubt into Miller's assessment. compelling a revaluation of the situation beyond the HOA's initial narrative. Ms. Albright, a central figure in the HOA's enforcement efforts, displayed visible signs of discomfort during these proceedings. Her composure, typically unyielding, showed subtle indications of strain as Julian systematically dismantled the HOA's case. Her physical demeanor, specifically the tightening of her hands, indicated an underlying personal investment in failure. This reaction suggested that her opposition transcended mere adherence to community regulations, hinting at a deeper, unstated motivation driving her aggressive stance against the food forest. The interaction underscored a growing recognition that Ms. Albright's objectives were not solely aligned with procedural enforcement but contained an unarticulated personal dimension. Julian's academic background instilled a systematic approach to investigation, prompting him to analyze the disproportionate aggression exhibited by the Homeowners Association HOA, particularly by Ms. Albright. The intensity of their opposition suggested underlying motivations beyond simple adherence to community regulations. This initiated a deeper inquiry, extending beyond the HOA bylaws to include Ms. Albright's personal history and the HOA's broader operational activities. The initial insight into Ms. Albright's motivations emerged from a conversation with Mrs. Davison, a long-term resident of the community. Mrs. Davison recounted Ms. Albright's persistent preoccupation with lawn aesthetics, including her past attempts to establish a community-wide best lawn competition. This initiative ultimately failed due to a lack of widespread community engagement, indicating a singular focus on an aesthetic ideal not universally shared. This anecdote revealed Ms. Albright's long-standing personal investment in a specific, uniform landscape, suggesting an almost obsessive adherence to perceived outdoor order. Her strong negative reaction to the introduction of any non-traditional landscaping, such as a previous resident's rock garden, reinforced this observation. This information provided a foundational understanding. Ms. Albright's zealous enforcement of aesthetic standards was not merely a civic duty but a manifestation of a personal need for control and uniformity. Julian's food forest, with its diverse and naturalistic appearance, directly challenged her rigid aesthetic paradigm. It represented a departure from the manicured, homogeneous lawns she championed, becoming a direct affront to her deeply held vision of community, beauty, and order. The food forest, therefore, was perceived not just as a violation of rules, but as a personal challenge to her authority and aesthetic principles. Further investigation into publicly accessible HOA meeting minutes revealed the presence of a new development proposal. This proposal pertained to a vacant parcel of land immediately adjacent to the existing community. The proposed development was spearheaded by a developer with a known history of constructing luxury estates characterized by extensive, uniform, monoculture lawns. Ms. Albright had been a vocal and consistent advocate for this specific development project, actively promoting its approval within the HOA. The correlation between Ms. Albright's endorsement of this development and her aggressive stance against Julian's food forest became increasingly apparent. The proposed luxury estates were marketed on a specific aesthetic one of pristine, traditional suburban landscapes. Julian's food forest, with its emphasis on biodiversity and natural processes, represented a stark visual contrast to this marketing strategy. Its presence could be interpreted as an eyesore from the perspective of a developer aiming to sell properties based on a consistent conventional aesthetic. This alignment suggested a potential conflict of interest for Ms. Albright. Her vigorous opposition to the food forest might not have been solely about upholding existing community standards, but rather about facilitating the adjacent development, which aligned with her personal aesthetic preferences and potentially offered benefits to the community that she endorsed. The food forest, in this context, was not just an unapproved landscaping choice but an impediment to a larger, externally driven agenda that Ms. Albright supported. It was a tangible element that visually disrupted the sterile, uniform vision the developer and, by extension, Ms. Albright were attempting to propagate for the new luxury homes and the broader area. The implication was clear. Julian's property, with its thriving natural ecosystem, became an obstacle to a potential financial gain or the realization of a deeply ingrained, albeit misdirected, ideal shared by Ms. Albright and the developer. The seemingly straightforward HOA complaint was, therefore, layered with unstated motivations, transforming the conflict from a simple bylaw dispute into a complex battle rooted in personal bias, aesthetic control, and potential economic influences. This deeper understanding of Ms. Albright's underlying motivations fundamentally reshaped Julian's approach to the ongoing dispute. The Homeowners Association escalated its enforcement actions, issuing a formal notice of violation that detailed an escalating schedule of daily fines. This official communication initiated a new phase of the conflict. directly impacting Julian's financial resources and creating a tangible consequence for his non-compliance. The imposition of financial penalties represented a significant increase in the pressure exerted by the HOA, moving beyond verbal warnings and written notices to direct economic deterrence. Beyond the official sanctions, Julian encountered a noticeable shift in community dynamics. Subtle forms of social pressure became apparent. Neighborhood interactions, once characterized by cordiality, evolved into instances of veiled judgment and avoidance. Whispers circulated when he was observed in public spaces or even while conducting routine activities on his property. Silent glances replaced direct greetings from individuals who had previously engaged in friendly exchanges. This pervasive atmosphere of social scrutiny indicated a community influenced by the HOA's narrative, leading to a degree of social ostracization. The perception of his property as a violation or problem within the community fostered a sense of being an outsider. Despite his prior integration, a limited number of residents offered private, quiet expressions of support, acknowledging the benefits of his food forest or expressing reservations about the HOA's aggressive stance. However, the majority of the community either tacitly supported the HOA's position or, more commonly, refrained from any public display of dissent, likely due to a desire to avoid similar scrutiny or conflict with the powerful HOA board. This widespread reticence to openly support Julian further amplified the sense of isolation and the pervasive influence of the HOA's authority. The continuous scrutiny and the formal designation of his property as illegal or unclean by official channels began to affect Julian. The sustained campaign to delegitimize his efforts, coupled with the social pressures, exerted a cumulative psychological weight. This environment of sustained opposition prompted moments of self-doubt. He questioned whether his commitment to the food forest had led him to misjudge the community's tolerance for deviation from established norms. The intensity of the backlash compelled a reevaluation of his initial approach, causing him to momentarily assess if his passion had overshadowed a realistic understanding of community expectations. A pivotal conversation with his sister, Lena, provided a critical turning point in Julian's resolve. Lena, a public defender, offered a perspective that reframed the dispute. Her assessment highlighted that the conflict extended beyond a simple property dispute. It encompassed fundamental questions of individual autonomy and the right to make independent choices regarding land use. She articulated that Julian's ongoing stand was not merely a defense of his specific garden, but a broader assertion of the right to cultivate land in a manner consistent with personal values and ecological principles. Lena's analysis underscored that the HOA's actions were fundamentally about maintaining control and enforcing conformity, rather than strictly adhering to justifiable regulations. She emphasized that the food forest had become a symbol of defiance against arbitrary authority and rigid interpretations of community standards. This external perspective reaffirmed the larger implications of his struggle, transforming it from a personal burden into a principled stand against systemic overreach. Her firm counsel served to dissipate Julian's self-doubt and reinforce his commitment to the cause. The conversation provided a renewed sense of purpose, solidifying his determination to continue the fight and resist the pressure to concede. This reinforcement was crucial in fortifying his resolve against the mounting challenges. The annual Homeowners Association (HOA) meeting, traditionally a low-attendance event focused on routine administrative matters, experienced an unprecedented turnout. Community interest was exceptionally high due to widespread discussions surrounding the lawn incident, drawing a significant number of residents, eager for updates or a direct observation of the unfolding dispute. Ms. Albright, presiding over the meeting, initiated the proceedings with an air of controlled confidence. She swiftly transitioned to the new business segment, where Julian's alleged violation was designated as the primary agenda item. Her presentation of the HOA's case was delivered with practiced rhetoric, framing Julian as a recalcitrant homeowner, a detrimental influence on neighborhood property values, and a disruptive force to community harmony. Julian's turn to present began with a deliberate display of composure, a stark contrast to Ms. Albright's accusatory tone. He commenced by projecting satellite imagery of his property. The initial image depicted the previously barren, traditional lawn, establishing a baseline. This was juxtaposed with a current image of the property, showcasing the lush biodiversity and thriving growth of the food forest. This visual comparison served as an immediate, irrefutable illustration of the transformation and the success of his ecological project. Following the visual introduction, Julian presented his extensive documentation. This included detailed soil analysis, which demonstrated significant improvements in water retention and overall soil health within the food forest area. He also submitted pest reports compiled by an independent entomologist. These reports specifically debunked Ms. Albright's earlier, unsubstantiated claims regarding an increase in rats or other pests, providing scientific data to refute the allegations. Furthermore, he presented the horticulturist's affidavit, which officially verified the health, ecological benefits, and intentional design of his cultivated space, reinforcing its status as a professionally planned and maintained landscape. Julian then systematically addressed the legal aspects of the dispute. He projected relevant sections of the HOA bylaws, methodically highlighting clauses pertaining to permissible landscaping. His presentation meticulously demonstrated that the design and composition of his food forest did not violate any explicit provisions within these bylaws. By directly referencing the governing documents, he exposed the ambiguity and lack of specific, prohibitory language that the HOA had previously exploited. His argument focused on the principle that the absence of a clear prohibition implied permissibility, particularly when the activity conferred demonstrable ecological benefits. The culminating point of Julian's presentation involved the revelation of Ms. Albright's underlying personal and potential financial motivations. He projected excerpts from previous HOA meeting minutes, which detailed her active and enthusiastic endorsements of the proposed luxury development project adjacent to the community. These minutes included Ms. Albright's written statements, which explicitly emphasized the importance of maintaining consistent, traditional suburban aesthetics to attract high-end buyers. This established a direct link between her advocacy for the development and her insistence on a specific, uniform aesthetic for the existing community. He then presented a crucial piece of overlooked evidence, an email chain obtained through a public records request. This chain, exchanged between Ms. Albright and the developer's marketing team, contained discussions about mitigating potential visual inconsistencies within the area. This phrase, when contextualized with her opposition to Julian's property, served as thinly veiled confirmation that his food forest was perceived as a visual inconsistency that could negatively impact the marketability of the new luxury homes. This email exchange exposed a direct personal interest on Ms. Albright's part beyond the general enforcement of community standards. Ms. Albright's reaction to this revelation was immediate and pronounced. Her previously controlled demeanor fractured, her face visibly paled, and her carefully constructed composure disintegrated. She erupted in a high-pitched protest. "This is slander. He's making this up." Her voice lost its polished, authoritative tone, revealing raw desperation and uncontrolled anger. The public display stripped away her carefully maintained facade, exposing the underlying personal vendetta, her fear of disruption to her meticulously ordered world, and the unaddressed conflict of interest. Officer Miller, present at the back of the meeting room, observed Ms. Albright's unraveling. His posture shifted, and his gaze remained fixed on her, signifying a clear recognition that the narrative he had initially been given was incomplete and potentially misleading. The truth of the matter had become undeniably apparent. The immediate aftermath of Julian's presentation was characterized by a profound silence within the community hall. Residents who had previously engaged in quiet discussions or maintained neutral expressions exchanged visible glances of astonishment and dawning comprehension. The earlier atmosphere of gossip and speculation surrounding Julian's property was abruptly replaced by a collective realization of the deeper, personal motivations behind Ms. Albright's actions. This shift indicated a fundamental change in the community's perception of the dispute. Ms. Albright, publicly exposed and stripped of her authority, attempted to offer incoherent and fragmented protests. However, her arguments lacked substance and conviction, further highlighting her defeat. She visibly slumped in her chair, her prior commanding presence completely eroded, signaling a definitive capitulation. The HOA board, confronted with Julian's irrefutable evidence and the undeniable exposure of their president's personal bias and potential conflict of interest, faced an unavoidable decision. Under the weight of compelling facts and the clear breach of ethical conduct by their leader, they had no alternative but to reverse their stance. The board's subsequent actions marked a clear legal resolution to the dispute. A unanimous vote was cast to formally rescind the violation notice previously issued to Julian. This act nullified all prior claims of noncompliance and validated his landscaping choices. Concurrently, all accumulated fines, which had been progressively increasing, were officially waived, removing the significant financial burden imposed upon him. Furthermore, the HOA board issued a formal apology to Julian Vance. This public acknowledgement recognized his efforts to enhance the community's ecological health and tacitly admitted to the overreach and misjudgment in their previous enforcement actions. The apology served as a critical step in restoring Julian's standing within the community and validating his contributions. The legal resolution confirmed the permanence and legality of Julian's food forest. Beyond the legal victory, a profound emotional and social resolution transpired. Neighbors who had previously maintained distance or expressed disapproval now approached him directly. These interactions were marked by genuine apologies for their earlier skepticism or not support, along with expressions of admiration for his unwavering commitment to his principles. This shift in social dynamics signified a restoration of his community ties and a recognition of his moral strength. Julian's status within the community underwent a significant transformation. He transitioned from being perceived as a radical outsider, challenging established norms, to a respected visionary. His actions were now viewed as a principled stand for individual rights and ecological stewardship. Officer Miller, who had initially approached Julian with dismissiveness, displayed a clear gesture of newfound respect as Julian departed the meeting, acknowledging the legitimacy of his cause. Julian's experience rapidly became a prominent local narrative. It evolved into a cautionary tale regarding the potential for unchecked authority within community governance structures and underscored the quiet, yet potent, power of truth and persistence in the face of injustice. This narrative served as a significant educational tool within the community, encouraging critical reflection on the arbitrary nature of certain community standards and the importance of accountability. Leveraging this newfound respect and the positive outcome, Julian initiated a local community program named Green Roots. This initiative was designed to provide practical guidance and support to other residents interested in transforming their own properties into productive, ecologically beneficial ecosystems. The program aimed to help individuals navigate HOA regulations, understand sustainable landscaping practices, and foster a broader adoption of permaculture principles within the neighborhood. Julian's victory transcended a mere personal triumph. It became a catalyst for challenging rigid, often arbitrary, definitions of community standards, particularly those prioritizing aesthetic uniformity over ecological benefit and individual expression. His success underscored the resilience required to uphold personal values and demonstrated that true beauty and justice could emerge from challenging established norms. He reflected on the ease with which systemic frameworks could be manipulated by personal biases and the critical importance of steadfastly confronting injustice, not solely for individual vindication, but for the fundamental human dignity inherent in choice and the right to nurture life and land. The acclaimed ecologist, who had initially sought a quiet, personal project, had inadvertently ignited a broader movement, proving that meaningful change and genuine community enrichment often flourish in the most unexpected and seemingly unconventional spaces.